the first video documenting my series, 30 Days with Gouache. I chose to do landscapes for the 30 days as I do not usually do landscapes, and I wanted to practice them. This is my first time using regular gouache. This is Winsor & Newton gouache. I have used acrylic gouache in the past to do the 100 Pantone postcard challenge, so I'm looking forward to playing with a new medium. Here's me setting up my palette. I did end up ordering a few more colors, but they had not yet come in time for April 1st. So I just set up my palette for the time being, and I will add those colors when they do arrive. These colors include primary yellow, permanent yellow deep, vermilion, spectrum red, primary blue, ultramarine, permanent green middle, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and ivory black. Now that we got that all figured out, let's go ahead and move on to the first day. So here's day one. I chose a simple layout for day one so that way I could get my feet wet, so to speak. These are tiny canvases. They are 2.5 by 3.75 inches, Stonehenge Aqua, cold press heavy paper. I had a lot of these around. I think I got them on sale, so I decided that'd be perfect to practice with. Now, these first 5 days are done with pictures I took myself while I was walking downtown San Antonio. Most of them just being random storefronts that I saw that caught my eye. I was also experimenting with doing washes before layering one color on top of the other. So for this one, I chose the color Yellow Deep since the colors of the photo were warm. I'm also not going for super realism. I'm just trying to get the shape and the form of the building that I'm painting. I do not know what called me to paint this building, but I do know that I love the color. I was trying to not go super thick in the beginning. I was trying to layer, build up color as I went in the painting. I do think I was going with a brush that was too small for the washes, and this is something that I did not learn from for the next few days. I started painting the roof tiles before painting the sky. It was dusk, so I was trying to get this picture as close to deep blue, purpley as possible, mixing in spectrum red with the ultramarine to try and get that deep purple color, and I think it was good for the backdrop of this painting. I did spend a lot of time mixing colors and going back and forth to try and get the right stone color and the right pinkish red for the building. Now for this part, I think I was using the wrong size brush, again, but that's a reoccurring thing with me since when I'm oil painting, I try to use larger brushes to get that more impressionistic look to them. Something I am learning is when working with these smaller canvases is that it is okay to work with smaller brushes, and that's something that I'm just going to have to get used to as I work on them over the next 30 days. With the shadows, I used the same color for the brick face, but I used some ultramarine mixed in there. I would usually add purples to make some shadows, but I did not have purple at this time, so I'm using ultramarine. I just kept adding more and more ultramarine until I got the different shades that I wanted to differentiate the different levels of shadows. The little alcove was a little harder. I wanted it to be the same base color as the brick, but I also wanted it to be dark, so I just kept darkening it until I got a color that I was happy with. And then I moved on to the balcony, which was my favorite part of this little painting. I was enjoying doing little tiny details with my tiny detail brush, and I really need to get more comfortable with using that detail brush. Brickwork, I wanted the yellow to show through a little, so I started off with permanent yellow deep, some burnt sienna, and a little vermilion, and then I just mixed in white a little bit at a time till I got the colors and shades that I wanted. I did have the issue where I would move to the next part before I was completely happy with the brick, so I kept having to relighten the colors and then redarken them as I went back and forth. Till I got something that I was happy with. I also did some more layering in these areas to try and get contrast. I also have the issue where the camera wanted to focus on my hand instead of the painting. It's funny that despite the fact I work in technology, technology doesn't like me very much. Here is me ripping off the tape, which I usually use painter's tape, but it was ripping up the paper, so I didn't want that, so I had to switch to using regular masking tape. The masking tape still was ripping the paper, but it wasn't ripping it as bad, so I'm okay with that. Don't sign my work, so I got to decide where I would sign my work for this series, which I chose the bottom right hand side with a tiny brush and the little white space that's been left by the tape. So day two, this was another building I found downtown, and I didn't know what color wash I wanted to do, so I ended up going with primary yellow. Now, I did have a little trouble with the sky since blue and yellow made green, so I ended up having to go in with thicker paint and several layers to get the color where I was happy with it. Now, since there were some trees in this picture, I did want to start off painting with those before I started painting the building. And since I only had one green, I had to darken it with ultramarine or I had to lighten it with primary yellow. Now, I did end up liking the colors that I mixed and the definition that I got between the trees in the end, so I think I got some happy little trees from it. So after the trees, I then started on the brickwork. This building was a very ruddy red color, so I was mixing burnt sienna with spectrum red to try and get a color I was happy with. I was also trying to learn from my mistakes with the last painting and trying to figure out which parts of the building were the same shade before moving on. We also got to enjoy the camera focusing on my hand. Hello, hand! This painting was a lot more little bits to it than I was used to, so I was trying to use this number 2 round brush to fill in all the little details as I went. I ended up using this brush for a lot of this painting. I went back to the ruddy red and started adding some shadows before I started working on the smaller parts of the building. Since these parts were lighter and more yellow, I took some of the red I'd made and mixed it with primary yellow and then some white to get what I wanted. I also wanted to focus on the little triangle part of the building that was jutting out, trying to get that more gray color for that section of the roof. Now, the brush I was using was too big for these details, but I was fine. I ended up mixing ultramarine to get the shadows and darker hues I wanted for the detail work, and then I went in with the straight ultramarine on the red brick work to give it some definition. After that, I moved back to the main part of the building and was using a ruddy red to add shadows to the left where the sun wasn't hitting. And then I tried to move on to some detail work that I was trying to make sure the colors were distinct, but I was going in way too watery, so they weren't showing up as well as I would have liked. I ended up having to go in with thicker paint and then had to reapply the darker paint to get the detail work where it would stand out. I also had to go in and make sure in a few places where I felt the shadows were needed to be darker. So going in and adding all these little details probably could have waited till later, but live and learn. Next was the arches, where I made them the lightest part so far of the painting since they were catching the light of the sun. I also added the same color to the top of the building. I was still using a brush that was too big in the skyline, but I then went in on the arches and added the undershadows for all of them, trying to keep the correct shape. For the windows, I used the green mixed in with ultramarine, and then I used that same color for the outflow, though when it dried it was more green than blue, so I would have to go in and fix that later. I added gray for the balcony, with some white to mimic the reflection, and then I took that same gray, added a little bit more white, and then used that for the windows. That they had on the alcove, which I spent so much time drawing out. Since it was now covered in paint, I had to freehand it with white, and I'm not 100% happy with how it ended up, but I can go in and fix that later. I also did go in with a darker paint for the windows to show where they were reflecting, so I then fixed up the skyline and the roof, added in some lines for the brickwork on the arches before I cleaned up the windows. I wanted to add some leaves to the trees, so I went in with some straight permanent green middle to both of the trees, giving them some leaf texture. Once again removing the tape from the little painting, though I did not leave as much space as I had previously did for the edges. Now, day 3 was the outside of a bank, I believe. Now, this painting had more red hues to it, so I wanted to try and use primary red as the wash. This ended up giving everything a pink hue and made the final product have a very fairy tale feel. I do think that these brushes are okay, but it's only day 3 and this flat brush is starting to lose shape, which tells you how rough I am on my brushes. I did try to get a good tan color for the pillars. I had to try a few times before I got the color I liked, and then I moved on to the top of the building, trying to find a good red for the triangle areas. I ended up going a little bit more blue than I meant to, but I like how it ended up in the end. I was also trying to add shadows to the pillars and soften the edges of the color, which I'm not used to doing yet. I moved around from the bottom of the pillars. Finding the right colors for this area was a little harder because I wanted them to be similar to the pillars, but I also wanted them to stand forward. After the pillars, I moved to the umbrella area to the left, going in with a dark green. Ended up hating that completely, and then I had to do the dark storefront that was under it. That was mostly a mix of spectrum red and burnt sienna. At this point, I knew I had gone too dark for the umbrella, and I tried to lighten it up and give it some more definition with a lighter green and a slightly less dark green. After that, I started working on the arches, but the color was too similar to the triangle area, so I tried to make it more pink and slightly darker before I started adding the shadows to the under part of the arches, which turned out okay, I think. I moved back and forth between the arches and the left storefront for a while before I decided to work on the sidewalk and trying to make it the lightest part of the painting. It ended up taking a few layers, but I think it got to a good color. I then tried to paint in the window panes with a dark green, which I think complemented the pink very well before hitting some highlights where the sun would be hitting with a lighter green. I did realize I forgot to draw on the bottom of the door and the right side of it, but that was an easy fix. Now, I painted the windows in a similar method to how I did with the windows in the previous painting, but I wanted the paint to keep showing through, so I kept the paint a little watery and thin. I did end up going over the window panes a little bit, and I may go back and fix those at a later date, but not right now. Those were supposed to be quick studies, and I'm not spending more than an hour, hour and a half on these. I did end up adding some highlights and shadows to the windows to give them more of a dimension while keeping the pink showing through. Here's where I started working on all the little details of the painting, starting with the steps. I did have a problem where the steps were lighter than the building but darker than the sidewalk. That was a fun balance. But after finding the stairs getting to a semi-state of what I wanted, I started working on the bottom of the pillars, choosing to go with more purple so that way they stood out and actually used the spectrum red to darken it up for the shadows. I did end up going in and adding some small purples to the shadow areas to add definition. I also got out my tiny detail brush to add the little bow-like things to the front of the pillars. I then got to work on the middle beams for the building, but I like how they turned out even though I'm still using brush that was way too big for this area. The little swirl areas at the top of the pillars were done in a light purple to bring balance to the bottom of the pillars before I added details such as the actual little swirls on top of them. And that was the end of day 3. Like I said, I ended up liking how the pink showed through and the fairy tale look it gave to this painting. And yes, I am aware I keep forgetting to sign my paintings. And yes, it will also keep happening. Day 4, I decided to do an object instead of a building. I chose the fountain in the gardens at the Mango Hotel. Fun fact, the Mango Hotel is the longest running hotel west of the Mississippi, supposedly, and is supposedly haunted. For this painting, I decided to go with a wash of primary yellow again, and I decided that I would paint the sky first since it's in the background, but that did take several layers of blue to get where I was happy with it, because of course yellow and blue makes green. And this is also the painting where I started to get more comfortable with using smaller brushes since I was using more detail brushes to work on the fountain. I was trying to get that concrete color for the fountain. It wasn't quite a true gray, so I was using burnt sienna, yellow ochre when mixing with my grays for the fountain. I used like 4 different shades of the same gray, deciding which parts of the fountain would be getting the sunlight, and then painting those, and then moving on to the next section, which was slightly darker, to hopefully stop the recurring light and dark mixing that I had been doing in the previous paintings. I also got to pull out my new detail brushes for this, since it had such small details that I knew my size 2 brush would not have been able to do, and I am happy with the way it ended up looking in the end with all the nooks and crannies with it. After I was happy with the fountain, I started working on the bushes, which was an exercise in how dark was too dark and how light would be too light. The bush on the right was also a purplish color, which looked brown with the yellow wash, so I had to do several layers to get to look the right color. I then also went in with some red at the end to the top of the leaves, showing them reflecting light. The green bush towards the front also had to have some layering done with primary yellow before I went in and added leaves to the left bush, and then attempted to add some pink roses. Since the background was done, I then went in with some white and added the water reflecting the light as it fell from the fountain. And then I went back to the forward bush and added some red roses. That was all for day 4, and this time I didn't forget to add my signature. Clap! For day 5, I focused on the tower of the San Antonio courthouse. The architecture of the structure just made me want to draw it, even with all the little details. So this time I went in with a wash of yellow ochre since the building was darker than the previous ones I had painted so far. To start, I mixed a ruddy brown and then I started painting the details of the building, though I did have to go back in and add darker shadows to that. Once those parts were painted, I decided to paint the darkest parts of the tower first, which were the alcoves and the windows. I used the same color for all of them at first, though I would go in later and have to add in some ultramarine to try and darken them up. After painting the alcoves and the windows, I then started with the actual building itself, going in with a slightly more red-brown and then adding shadows to the sides facing away from the sun. At this point, I was also adding the lit up areas of the alcoves that would be getting some light. I then moved on to the next section of the building, pulling even more red into the brown mixture I was using, and then trying to darken it up once that paint had dried on the page. I was still not used to the wet on wet technique for gouache, but I'm slowly getting there the more I practice. After that, I started on the roof of the lower part of the building, but the green was too bright, so I wiped it away and I added more blue-green to it. Then I started painting the building and the small tower, trying to make sure that the colors were different enough that they didn't get lost in each other. I began working on the details with my little detail brush, trying to make sure it wasn't too pink while still being red. I started working on the top of the building, painting the building itself before adding the roof and the roof tiles. I tried to add more shadows so that way it would be reflecting the fact that the top is a hexagon. And next, after that, I started working on the arches, which in the end did end up getting a little lost, so I added those details later on, such as the bricks. I also ended up having to go back in on the green portion of the roof to make it darker. Once I had added all the little details to the building itself, I decided I would go in and add the sky. which I had to do several layers of, which I got used to since the wash was yellow, and since it was ochre, it was turning the blue kind of muddy, so I really had to layer it. After painting in the sky, that's also when I realized I missed the most bottom right hand side of the painting, so I had to go back in and paint that section and to make sure I added the shadows. And that was day 5, finishing up the first 5 days of the 30 days of gouache for April. Alright, so here are the 5 of my paintings so far. I've already started to learn so much from each of these, and I look forward to continuing to learn as I proceed to go through this challenge. Now, I hope everyone has a good day and enjoys the rest of their week. Bye!